Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at JCRC Speaker Series for a conversation with Senator Eric Lesser. My name is Leah Robbins, and I'm on the board here at JCRC. One of the things that drew me to JCRC is that it's a broad coalition of organizations and individuals in the Jewish community that come together to advocate on behalf of shared priorities. And one of those core values for me that JCRC lifts up is giving voice to vulnerable members of our society, those who've been underserved and not had access to needed resources. I am so thrilled that we're able to have this conversation today to hear from one of our partners in this work, Senator Lesser. But first, I'd like to introduce Jeremy Burton, JCRC's Executive Director. Jeremy?
Thank you, Leah, and welcome everyone. Thrilled to have you all join us here today for this conversation. My name is Jeremy Burton, and as Leah said, I'm the Executive Director of JCRC. There's going to be, just before we get started, to let people know an opportunity for your questions as we get farther into the session. So please, those of you who've been with us throughout this last year, you know how to do this. Use the Q&A feature to submit any questions for our guest, and we will try to cover as much ground as possible during our time together. And in the spirit of covering as much ground as possible in our time together, I'm not going to read the entire bio of our guest today, except to say that Senator Eric Lesser is genuinely a friend on a personal level and to JCRC. For those of you who don't know him, and I recognize part of this is getting to know him, he is the senator from 9 communities in the 1st Hampden and Hampshire district, to which he was elected in November of 2014, proudly serving Western Massachusetts in his 4th term in the state Senate, which of course also may mean that he may be a little less familiar to some parts of our Boston Jewish community, because, sometimes we don't pay attention to, we don't really get to like seeing Jewish leaders who are emerging from other parts of our Commonwealth. And I'm really excited to talk to him today about that, about his work. He has fought for expanding passenger rail service since his first days in office, pushing for economic development to transform the relationship between Boston, Springfield, Western Massachusetts. He has a legislative agenda that focuses on economic opportunity and quality of life for Western Massachusetts, and we'll talk a little bit about that. He's also been an incredible partner and ally on work of concern specifically to the Jewish community and to other communities dealing with hate, violence, and other sort of threats to our ability to experience and live as communities in the Commonwealth during his time in office, and we'll get to that as well. I'm really thrilled again to present my friend and a friend of JCRC, Senator Eric Lesser, who is also finally, I'll mention, a recipient of our Legislative Leadership Award in 2018. And we'll throw his full bio in the chat. So, Senator Lesser, if I can ask you to turn on your camera and your mic, I want to thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to start by asking you to talk a little bit about your journey as a Jewish leader, the community you grew up in, getting involved in politics and public life, and ultimately becoming a Jewish leader serving in public office. Senator.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Can everybody hear me okay?
We're good.
And you can see me okay, right? Okay, great. So first, I just really want to thank you. I was really looking forward to this because we're friends, and I feel like this is kind of like just a public version of the conversations you and I love to have all the time. But for me, my Jewish values and my Jewish upbringing suffuse everything I do and the work I do every day. I grew up in Longmeadow, which for people who might not be familiar from Eastern Mass, if you get on the Mass Pike and drive 90 miles west, you'll hit Longmeadow. And the Longmeadow Springfield Jewish community is a really vibrant, proud Jewish community. I actually came here via New York when I was 7. And was a product of Sinai Temple in Springfield, Massachusetts. I was the president of SPIFTY, the Springfield Federation of Temple Youth, which was our nifty chapter. Every once in a while, we crossed into Eastern Mass for events with our friends in the Metro Boston area. And some of my earliest kind of consciousness raising and political activity as a high school student and even younger was through the Jewish community in Western Mass. I helped lead, along with a group of other high school students, a Black Jewish dialogue between Alden Baptist Church in Springfield and Sinai Temple in Springfield. And it was conversations in my confirmation classes and in my Hebrew school and in Sunday school, religious school classes that I really started to grapple with a lot of the questions we still deal with in the Massachusetts Senate. And frankly, just because I know a lot of people maybe on this call have been involved in organized Jewish life and educational practices, it gave me a lot of confidence as a kid growing up. It gave me a lot of chances to practice organizational skills, working with communities to push for things. And I'm really grateful for that, and a lot of mentors in that community that supported me along the way. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
Somebody had to do it.
It wouldn't be a Zoom call without a mute. Yeah.
There you go. So before we get into like policy and your work on Beacon Hill, I want to dive a little more into your journey from a Jewish kid growing up in Longmeadow to actually being a state senator. And I know that there were a couple of stops along the way and some interesting stories that you shared over the years, but may not be familiar to some folks down at this end of the Commonwealth. So you talked about being in a youth group and that leadership skills. So take us a little bit of a step forward. How'd you get into active politics? And tell us about that.
Well, so I did some work with the Religious Action Center when I was in high school. There was a rabbi that some of you might know, Mark Shapiro, who was the rabbi at Sinai Temple, who unfortunately he passed away last summer, but was a real icon for us, especially in the progressive Jewish community in Western Mass. And he kind of took me under his wing, and I participated in several Religious Action Center events, including a major march in Washington, as I think back to this, after the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000. That was an incredible event, just the scale and the size of it. But one thing led to another, and I ended up working in New Hampshire in 2007, driving. I would drive up from school every weekend, basically, and when I could during the week, to go help out in New Hampshire for this very long shot campaign, this skinny guy with a funny name, Barack Obama from Illinois. And it's hard to imagine this now, but one of my jobs when I first started helping out the campaign in New Hampshire was I had the very lucky gig of picking him up at the airport. So I remember we would go to an Avis rent-a-car facility in Manchester, and I would wait and pick him up off I remember the Southwest flight. There was one that would come from Chicago and one that would come from DC. And I would pick him up from the Southwest flight, drive him to a whole group of, a whole bunch of different house parties and things around New Hampshire. Then I'd get him back to the airport for his flight out. And this was right before iPhones, Jeremy. So, people would kind of recognize him in the airport, but it wasn't like now, obviously not like now, but it wasn't even like, I think, in the iPhone era where people would constantly stop for pictures. People would kind of do a once over, but he would take his shoes off through security just like everybody else, and had to take his belt off through the metal detector. And
when he was a freshman senator and not.
Exactly. And, one thing led to another. And after the New Hampshire primary, I was recruited to do the title that they gave me was Ground Logistics Coordinator, which is a dramatic exaggeration of a title. I was basically the equipment manager for then Senator Obama and for his team. So we would travel. Sometimes we'd be in 3, 4, 5 states a day. And he had a plane with about 10 or so staffers that had different responsibilities, and then about 30 reporters that would travel with us. And I was a little bit like the mom on a family of a vacation gone very, very wrong. I was in charge of kind of keeping track of everybody, kind of like your job, Jeremy, on the Israel trips, keeping track of everybody.
We'll get to that, but
Yeah.
I think you actually bring me back more to my days as an advance man and a body man for like various political candidates.
Yeah,
a similar point in my life. But
so anyway, that one thing led to another in the picture, and I keep that picture in my home office here. But the one thing led to another, and it was Passover of April 2008, and at the time there was just no way I was going to be able to get home because Just to let you know, Jeremy, because you've worked campaigns, I mean, there was just no way I could leave the kind of traveling team in any kind of responsible way and then get back while things were going so intense. So I saw and I realized that we were going to be in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the night of the first Seder. And I remember I went up to Senator Obama a couple of days before, and I mentioned to him, I said, hey, we might do like an impromptu thing to celebrate Passover. And he kind of said, oh yeah, he said, let me know if you do something and I'll come. And I thought he was sort of just being polite. One thing led to another. We ended up celebrating a small kind of makeshift Seder in the basement of the Harrisburg Sheraton. We found a windowless room. Someone who some people might know, because he grew up in Newton, Herbie Ziskin, was there with me. He was one of the advanced staffers who helped prep it for us. And we were down in this windowless basement room. I remember I snagged some Maxwell House Haggadahs and some Manischewitz wine that my cousin swiped from the UPenn Hillel. And we put this kind of makeshift Seder together. And I remember there was a kind of a Secret Service agent popped their head in, like kind of looked around, looked under the table briefly, and then within a minute or so, in popped Senator Obama, and we sat down and did the Seder. And it's interesting. I mean, this is probably, I'm digressing a little bit, but he's a pretty intense guy, which is maybe not a shock to people. But I remember at a certain point in the Seder, he turned to me and he said, "Hey, Lester, like, how do you guys do this in your family? Or what do you think of this part?" And I remember turning to him and saying, honestly, Senator, my family's never gotten this far. Because he was very intense about doing the whole every page.
He was committed to the full project.
Yeah. So, but anyway, we raised our glasses at the end, and of course did the famous part where you say "next year in Jerusalem." We put our glasses down. He put his up, and he said "next year in the White House." Fast forward a year later, I was working as the assistant to David Axelrod. We had a small office. I had a small cubby next to the Oval Office, directly adjacent to the Oval Office. And one day, President Obama popped in and he said, "Hey, Lester, are we doing the Seder?" And I was sort of taken aback. I was like, I don't know, are we? And he said, I said "next year in the White House," and we're here in the White House, so we're going to do the Seder. And make a long story short, it ended up being the first Seder celebrated by a president in American history, and we did it all 8 years of his presidency, so nine Seders together in total.
That's amazing. And I will say, I both love opportunities when, say, members of Knesset have come to Beacon Hill and come to the Senate floor, and I've introduced them to you as the guy who, was there to initiate the first what would become the White House Seder. And I will also say I enjoy, I've looked back over the years at some pictures of those 8 years in the White House and seeing you, and let's just say you change from year to year, and even I think growing as a family in the course of the time of those 8 years at the White House Seder, starting out sitting single, I think, next to the president, and then by the end as a family. It's been really sweet to watch all those pictures and to have that experience. But I want to, get a little bit more now into Beacon Hill and like some of the stuff that we talk about. Yep. And you referenced this, and obviously, already seeing some of the questions that are coming up that we'll get to and start to dive into. But we've traveled to Israel together. We have spent a lot of time on a bus talking to each other in Israel about a lot of different things.
A lot of kibitzing time.
A lot of kibitzing and a lot of serious conversations. And, we've had the pleasure, it wasn't just the two of us, it was also with several of your colleagues, some of whom are Jewish, some of whom are not, some of whom it was not their first time in Israel, some of whom it very much was their first time experiencing the region. And, I think folks would be interested in any reflection that you have from that experience, and about, frankly, as a Jewish leader who cares about the Jewish community, who feels personally connected to Israel, that's been part of your life, sort of like what that's like to be in conversation with other public officials about Israel, about the Palestinians, and about the region. And obviously, we're all very aware of this is a pretty historic week in Israel, but to back up and really you are a Jewish leader in that space with other civic leaders, and what's that conversation like for you
And by the way, just as a quick aside on that, because of what's happening in the news, I was watching, it was on yesterday, Sunday. There was a live stream. This is how much of a nerd I am, but I didn't spend all day doing this, but for a brief period of time, I was watching the live stream of the Knesset debate. And
So
even
was
the
I.
very, yeah, I knew you. And even the very small amount I watched, I was like, wow. This is democracy in action. I was like, you would have to go far back in American history to find a debate in the Massachusetts Senate or in the U.S. Congress that even approached the intensity of that debate. But anyway,
I was going to say, I don't think President Spilka would be having any of that on the floor. And I can remember coming on for one or two sort of honorific moments, and the ushers or whatever their titles are in the back being like, if you even whispered, they'd smack you down practically. So yeah, that was an experience.
Wow, heckling, yeah. But anyway, I think on a very real, I think especially for those of us who are Jewish, people active in the Jewish world and in JCRC, don't take as a given. And I think this was important for me to sort of see. I had been to Israel several times before, including going with President Obama before he was president. Went with him to the Old City, to the Western Wall. And also went for personal reasons with my family. But, don't take as a given that people really know a whole lot about the country. And that was but are very curious and want to learn. And that was really a great experience, actually, watching colleagues of mine who I really respect and who are very wise people, frankly, just learn and absorb so much of the complexity about Israel and the layers of history and memory and very current real life challenges that the country is struggling with. Just a really meaningful and deep experience. And then, I would just say, on a very real level, there's very important economic and cultural and political ties between Massachusetts and Israel. I remember bringing Yehudi Yaakov, who was the Israeli consul general, to Western Mass. This was several years ago, but we brought him to the Big E, which is one of the biggest agricultural fairs in the Northeast. Israel has a proud agricultural history. He was actually kibitzing with some of the agricultural vendors about drip irrigation in Israel and the innovations of the kibbutz movement and other things. And of course, we have a very important life sciences and tech ecosystem that's very integrated with Israel. So. And of course, there's quite a lot of Israelis living in Massachusetts and quite a lot of people from Massachusetts living in Israel. So on a very real level, there were important kind of economic, political, cultural ties that you could see kind of developing through the trip and learning about through the trip. But I think it was really a very personal moment and a set of personal moments for everybody that went through. And there's an element of being in Israel, which is you could be the most secular person in the world, right? You could be the most religious person, and I'm not just talking about Jewish, but obviously it's a sacred place for Islam, for Christianity, and you go there and you just see how intimate the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, the Dome of the Rock, the Kotel, all in this tight place. And even the most steely grizzled politician, I think, is going to see a lot of their veneer melt away in an environment like that.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna follow up because there's a question I think that's sort of a related, that's in the chat from Jonathan, and obviously there are issues related to the demonization of Israel that have been coming up, and frankly, with increasing frequency here in Massachusetts. And just a few weeks ago, we had a very public situation where in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there was an effort to get the city council to essentially endorse the boycott movement that not only seeks to pressure Israel, but to actually eliminate the state of Israel as a Jewish state. And that effort in Cambridge failed. But I know that you have colleagues who are sitting with the conflict element, who are struggling with the U.S.-Israel relationship. I know that you have colleagues who look at Israel and the Palestinian people and say, why don't we just solve it some way? And I think folks here, I'm not asking you to get specific about any one individual or to really talk, there's no legislation pending in the Massachusetts legislature on this to address, but I think people are curious from your perspective as someone who has been a Jewish leader in private and public conversation with lots of progressive leaders, how you talk about this or what that conversation might look like for you in a way that would help other people understand how to have that conversation.
First, again, kind of backing up to the original kind of conversation we were having about the trip is don't assume that people know everything, frankly, know all that much about Israel at all. And unfortunately, we live in a political culture right now where people make snap judgments and snap reactions based on Twitter, based on things that they see on social media, and are not diving a little bit deeper. So I frankly would challenge some of the narrative on certain segments of the progressive community about how Israel is discussed. If you want to talk about a country that's been a haven for refugees, this is something I feel strongly about. We fought tooth and nail. We worked with Maura Healey on suing the Trump administration over the Muslim ban in the U.S. But you want to talk about a country that's opened its door to refugees from every corner of the globe. No country on earth, especially given how poor and how small it was and still is, relatively speaking, when it started, has been a greater place for a safe harbor for refugees than Israel. You want to talk about systemic racism and oppression, perhaps there are a few hatreds you could find that are more ancient than anti-Semitism in terms of literally being embedded into much of European culture and other cultures and societies. And Israel has been a haven for people who have been persecuted by anti-Semitism. So, you want to talk about, worker empowerment. Israel was an icon of the global socialist movement, especially when it started, and the figures who built modern Israel, early Israel, were icons to the global worker movement. So, I think a lot of this history is frankly just not known or understood. And I think it's on us. I mean, it's on everyone, but it's on us as progressive Jews to, really talk about this. When I think about Israel advocates, I think about Tom Lantos. I think about Shimon Peres. We went to the Peres Center. I think about someone I got to know later in his life, Elie Wiesel, someone who I became very close with because he was very close with President Obama and very close with David Axelrod, who I worked for. And I don't think anybody would be able to describe those figures as right wingers or as people that didn't value human life and progress and progressive values. So, I think we're losing some of the conversation, frankly, and I think part of this is going to require a resetting and a refocus on some of that and how we engage with our allies.
Right. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's helpful for some of us who are maybe not in relationship with other civic leaders in the same way to hear your guidance and hear your thinking about this. So I thank you for sharing that. I want to switch gears and talk about something that you've been very passionate and eloquent about, and I want to thank you for it, which is your advocacy nonprofit security funding, which is also a priority that you share with us at JCRC. And I would say it was a truly remarkable experience for me watching the Senate floor in, I think it was 2019, when you, and if I recall correctly, every other Jewish member of the Senate essentially stood up and testified on the floor about experiences that you had personally had with anti-Semitism. And then again, just a few weeks ago, you spoke powerfully during the budget debate about rising anti-Semitism in America. Now, given the shocking rise in anti-Semitic speech and acts, I want to ask you to expand on this and talk about this with our audience. And I know there are many levels of this, both in terms of your personal experience, things that you have experienced in terms of hate and violence in Longmeadow and in Western Massachusetts that aren't frankly always on the radar, some of us in the Boston media market, and also how you've approached this as a public official who has had a personal role in moving literally millions of dollars in funding towards nonprofit security during your time in office, for which we are very grateful.
No, I appreciate that, Jeremy. And I had Robert Trustin from the Anti-Defamation League on my live stream. I've got to have you on my live stream, so I'll return the favor. I'll have you on. But I had Robert Trustin on last Friday to talk about this. But just in a very real sense, that the anti-Semitic incidents, and they're more than incidents. Some of them are just outright crimes and very violent, have been on the rise for years now, really since 2017. Maybe what the world saw in Charlottesville was kind of the most, the first of what became a series of, heinous acts. But you saw what happened with Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, the Poway shooting in California. Luckily, and thank God, we have not had overt violent acts to that scale in Massachusetts. But one of the things I talked about on the floor of the Senate in 2019 is, there, but for the grace of God, have we not? Because I can tell you in Western Mass, we had a very scary, an attempted bombing, frankly, a scary incident in April of 2020. A firebomb was placed at the entrance of the Jewish nursing home in Longmeadow. People can Google this. It was covered by the New York Times, CNN. The person was a guy in his mid-30s who was living in East Longmeadow, which is one of the communities I represent, a suburban community. He lived in a fairly nice, nondescript suburban house, and we know the story. He had been posting, racist and anti-Semitic language online. It eventually moved offline into the real world. The Springfield JCC in the last few years has faced five bomb scares in terms of people calling in bomb threats. And I'd point out, one of the things I tried to also do with this program is a lot of our communities have been under threat. There was a Black church in Springfield just in December that was burned to the ground severely burned after 5 arson attempts by the same individual. He was eventually caught. But it was a community, I know well, and a church in an area I know well, and I'm in frequently. And I'm a regular visitor to our Islamic Center in West Springfield, which is just across the river from where I live, very close to me. They've faced threats. So, we've got to really work, I think, in common purpose in the U.S. With allies and with other leaders, and say, we just can't accept this. And there's a lot of obviously kind of root issues here that need to be addressed. But at a base level, if a preschool, if a synagogue, if a mosque, if a community center, if a nursing home is saying to its government that they do not feel protected and they do not feel safe, which is what our organizations were telling us, we have to do something about it. And, Jeremy, just to, we can pat ourselves on the back about how much this program has expanded. But when this started, I get very worked up about this, I'm sorry. But this started in 2017 with 3 groups getting a total of $75,000 in funding. And we have now gotten it to $1.5 million. It's more than 10x, significantly more than 10x from where it was. But it is still, because I see we ask EOPS, which is the Executive Office of Public Safety, for the applications, the number of organizations asking for help and the amount that's actually put out the door in terms of grants is nowhere near the need. And these are chilling applications, a preschool, a summer camp asking for surveillance systems, asking for perimeter lighting, asking for blast-proof windows, asking for, barriers in their driveway to prevent car bombings. This is the world that we're living in now. And we have got to make sure that if an organization is coming to the state and saying that they need help to put these types of physical precautions in place, the state should be saying absolutely and should be there to help them.
Well, I very much not only appreciating your leadership, but the specificity in which you walk through some of this. And I don't think people fully appreciate. I remember that first year and, sort of like fighting for a pilot, and then it was like just gone and out the door. And then I know that over the years, there's been efforts to make sure that you've led on to make sure that the money is spread around the state, because hate comes to Longmeadow and not just to Boston or Cambridge. And community, the interest here for all of us. And you spoke to this. It's not just my interest as a member of the Jewish community to ensure that members of the Jewish community can gather in our spaces and celebrate the Jewish community and celebrate our traditions. It is in our interest as Americans to ensure that Muslims and Christians can also gather. It's in our interest to make sure that all people can benefit from the nonprofit infrastructure, because it's not just about even minority communities. We've seen this around sort of targeting of LGBT communities, or maybe of certain centers serving women's healthcare. Like, there's so many ways in which hate and violence is preventing people from accessing our First Amendment privileges in this country, and it's a real crisis we have.
And, when we can get into a very deep, philosophical, political conversation about why this is happening. I have my theories about why it's happening. I think many of us are maybe in agreement about some of the reasons why, but as a threshold matter, if a school, if a daycare, if a summer camp, a nursing home is saying to the state, we don't have the resources to keep our congregants safe, or to feel like we're keeping our congregants safe, that has got to be taken seriously. And I appreciate you mentioning the geographic disparity portion, Jeremy, because this is a very important point and something that's I'm passionate about. There was and had been a federal Department of Homeland Security grant program that was providing federal money to organizations that were at heightened risk of terrorist attack, is how they had described it. This came after 9/11. The Department of Homeland Security set this program up, except it was limited to big cities. So I believe the city of Boston qualified, and maybe one or two of the communities immediately adjacent to Boston qualified, but outlying communities did not qualify. The whole metro region of Worcester has a very strong and vibrant Jewish community. The Berkshires didn't qualify. The South Coast, the North Shore didn't qualify. So part of why we set this state program up is to supplement, the holes that you saw in that federal program that were only directing the money to specific geographies. And it's not to say, obviously, there's organizations in Boston that need and deserve that money. That's not the point. The point is that you can't leave out, basically by fiat, whole regions where you had vulnerability. Again, like I said, Springfield JCC in Springfield, Massachusetts had five bomb threat call-ins in the course of about a year. So you can't let something like that happen as a Commonwealth and not do something to plug the gaps.
Yeah, I appreciate you speaking that, and just, because some people in our audience may not be in the granular level that you have gotten into over the last 5 years or so on this topic, for which we are very grateful. And just, to note for the audience, and we'll move on, is like, that gap in the federal program has also been recognized, and there are efforts, including those being led by Jewish communities, including Jewish Federation North America, which we work with on advocacy in Washington, and members of Congress, to infill that gap on other parts of Massachusetts and other states that were left out of or underfunded in the original model of that program. But I want to move on to some other issues, because we've been talking about Israel, we've been talking about anti-Semitism, we've been talking about Seder's, and I think there's a connective thread here, which is both in terms of areas that we're both very interested in and we care about, but also about this idea of the gaps in society and how to eliminate gaps. We're speaking, like, even in this nonprofit security, we're talking about the gap between the urban funding initially in Boston versus the larger regional interests. You focused on persistent gaps and how to eliminate them in terms of opportunity. And I mentioned in my introduction the work that you've been doing on rail, but you've also prioritized student loans and a student loan borrower's bill of rights to protect borrowers across the Commonwealth. And I know that's something you've been passionate about. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit what drives your passion on this issue and how you see this bill of rights having an impact on equity.
Well, again, so much to unpack here with the issue of student loans, but I'll bring it back to my own, family's roots and my Jewish values, which is, in my family and, in many families, education was a great equalizer for my family. So my, dad, his family came from a traditional Jewish immigrant family, but his father, my grandfather, I'm not sure he graduated from high school. He worked as a tool and die maker in downtown Brooklyn, but he met my mom, who came from an Italian immigrant family, similarly traditional family. My grandfather was, on my mom's side, was a longshoreman. They met at City College in New York, where I think that the semester tuition was about $50. a semester. Now, even they didn't go to school that long ago. So even controlling for inflation, this idea that free college, and I don't like the term free, but this idea that, free college is some abstract, unattainable, completely wild idea. When you think about the fact that, baby boomers and even generations before that were able to get very high quality public education. City College was called, the working man's Harvard. That they were able to get that for $50 a semester. Think about the doors that opened for my family. My mom went on to get her PhD. She worked as a professor at Smith College here in Western Mass. My dad went on to get a medical degree and practice medicine in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and I get to be in the state Senate. So education always has been and always will be, if applied correctly and if you fund it correctly, a great equalizer for all people. We have a very specific issue right now in front of us, which is nearly 1 million people in Massachusetts currently owe student loans. I'm sure many people on the call are included in that. I paid mine off. Luckily, I was lucky. I was able to pay mine off.
Congrats.
But yeah, fairly just a few years ago. But many of the people on this call probably are still involved in paying their student loans. You have close to 1 million people right now that collectively owe $40 billion, more than that, in total student loans. And the companies that service the loans, companies like Navient, PCH, Navient's probably the most well-known. Many people get notices from Navient. You don't pick who that servicer is. And they're the ones responsible for notifying you of your payments, notifying you of your interest obligations, and also letting you know when you qualify for things like forbearance or deferred payment or public interest loan forgiveness. And there is zero regulation on a state level of these servicers. You need a license in Massachusetts to cut hair. You need a license to be a mechanic. You need a license to sell insurance. You do not need a license to service six-figure loan amounts over individuals, for many of whom this will be the most important financial transaction that they ever engage in. And it's the Wild West. Let me just give you an example, Jeremy, in real life of how this plays out. A constituent of mine wrote to me. She lives in East Longmeadow. She was a special education teacher. A worthy job. We need special education teachers, not a high paying job, also a job that requires education. She needed not only a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree to work as a special ed teacher. She took on debt to pay for that degree. Not a high paying, but a very important career that she was in. She had a lot of a high debt obligation. She was in her 30s. She has had two young children, and she got a cancer diagnosis. She needed to take time off from work in order to do her chemotherapy, and she had two young children to watch and take care of at the same time. She couldn't even get her student loan servicer on the phone to talk about things like forbearance, things like loan forgiveness, things like interest deferrals, all of which, by the way, she's legally entitled to under federal law. She actually moved to Connecticut. East Longmeadow borders Connecticut. East Longmeadow had passed the Student Loan Borrowers Bill of Rights, the bill that we just got done, that we had worked on after over 6 years. She moved to Connecticut where they had this law in place. And there was a student loan ombudsman that was assigned to her, a person from state government, to negotiate on her behalf with the student loan servicer. She was able to get into a loan deferral program. She was able to qualify for forbearance. She was able to hold off on the payments while she got her chemotherapy done and got her diagnosis fixed. So this is a real life example of how this law is going to help people. The law that was signed in January and is being implemented right now is going to create a new licensing regime for student loan servicers. They're going to have to apply to get a license in Massachusetts, and it's going to create a new enforcement power through the Attorney General to take action against servicers who, and in theory, take the license away from servicers who aren't letting individuals know about their rights. So it's going to help close to 1 million people, because again, you've got almost 1 million people in the state that have pending student loan debt.
First of all, Senator, congratulations, because that's a huge accomplishment. And I know passing a law in Massachusetts doesn't always happen quickly. So congratulations on that. And you clearly describing something very compelling that will have a significant impact on opportunity. And of course, this being JCRC and a Jewish audience conversation, I appreciate the way for you that connects to your own family experience of an immigrant experience of this question of expanding opportunity in America. I guess what I like to do is building on some of those themes and seeing there's a question from Kayla, which I think also connects to some of those themes, areas where maybe the legislation has moved a little more slowly, but is also about opportunity and immigrants, is the Work and Family Mobility Act, which would provide driver's license, including for those who are not currently documented in Massachusetts. I'd love to have, speak to that. I know that you have given great thoughts to that issue and have been involved with that. Can you speak to the Work and Family Mobility Act, what's going on Beacon Hill, how you think about that issue? And frankly, let me invite on that and everything else, what else we can be doing as a Jewish community to support efforts like these in Massachusetts.
Yeah. So, I've supported that in the past and continue to. The issue you've got, I don't know actually why we haven't made more progress on it. It's come up in previous sessions, and I believe the Senate voted on it maybe the session before last. That's an example of an issue where you're going to probably have some legislators that are going to be dug in or are going to be a no for whatever reason. But there are a group of legislators, I do believe, in my own conversations, that just have some questions about how a law like that is going to work. For example, we have federal ID requirements, and although licenses are issued by states, there's now a significant amount of sort of federal regulatory implementation involved in issuing a license. So I know other states have done versions of this. So learning a little bit more and educating lawmakers about how it's worked in other states, I think would be helpful. And also, I think personalizing the issue more, because I think in the abstract, this is an issue that's maybe easy to demagogue or easy to, direct one way or the other. But I think if you bring it down to the experience of an individual person. Look, I live in Western Mass. You need to drive. I mean, I'm a big proponent of the PVTA, and we don't have the rail yet. But for the most part, you need to drive, including people with very low income jobs and people who are, working in service jobs or from vulnerable communities. You just don't have public transit as a viable option in most places in Western Mass. So it's even more important. So I think the advocates have done a great job with that. I know Brendan Crichton, I believe, filed it last session and is carrying it again this session in the Senate. So I think, just continuing to focus on that. Something I learned, frankly, just to go back to the student loan bar Bill of Rights, is that when you talk about these issues in the abstract, like your brain just starts to, it just starts to turn into spaghetti. Especially something like student loans or driver's licenses. You're like, wait, can you do this? Can you not? How does that work? And I think if you just bring it down to what this actually means at an individual level for a family or for an individual person or worker, I think you'll gain traction.
Well, I very much appreciate both that insight and that sort of update about the larger issue. Building on that, and we've talked about this a lot over the years, when things are stuck or things are moving, and I'm looking at who's with us in the audience today, and I know there are a lot of very serious activists who are sort of here with us and very concerned about a wide range of issues. Let's expand on what you just said, and as someone who's now in your fourth term, what advice would you have for activists on, how to engage with Beacon Hill, how to be effective?
Yeah, well, I know I'm looking through the list. I know a lot of the people on this. Not some of the people, some people I don't, but it's a great group. What I'd say is a couple things. So first, I had a very wise person who I respect a lot, who I went to see shortly after I got elected in 2014. And he sat me down in his office, and he was an older guy, and he's like, all right, Lester, he goes, what's the most important vote you're ever going to take? And I was like, I don't know, like the vote for the budget. He's like, nah, it's not the vote for the budget. I said, I don't know, is it the vote for leadership, the committees? He's like, nah, it's not leadership vote. I was like, I don't know, abortion. What's the most important vote? I have no idea. He said the most important vote is the next vote.
Mm.
And I think that is a really important way to look at it. State legislatures, and especially a smaller state like Massachusetts, really are different than Congress or federal. One of the things I've just learned over the last sort of 4 terms, and I came from Washington, where it's trench warfare every single day, one side against another, battle to the, gladiator battle every single day. And there are elements to which that happens in Massachusetts, but for the most part, state legislators are citizen legislators. They're in their communities, and they're not dug in an ideological camp one way or the other, and they do change their minds,
Mhm.
and people do change their minds. And so I would say, be forceful, be passionate, but remember, the most important vote is always the next vote. So don't burn it all down on anyone. And I'll just give you one example from my own
Please.
experience. So when I, got in, I was just guns blazing on East-West Rail, of course, which I'm still very, very passionate about. But I noticed that I wasn't getting the traction that I thought I would, or that I was hopeful that I would, and I did a little bit of soul searching, and I talked to some people, who I respect and whose opinions, I really value, and they were kind of giving me feedback that was important. They were saying, you're presenting this as a project for Western Mass.
Mhm.
And that's great for somebody who lives in Western Mass, but why would somebody who doesn't live in Western Mass want to do something for Western Mass? And I was
Right. Like,
aghast.
tell me in Cambridge why I should care about that.
Yeah, exactly. And I was shocked. I was like, well, of course you'd want to help Western Mass. Cambridge has everything. We need things but that wasn't persuasive, and it shouldn't be persuasive. But what I realized is that if you presented the project not as a project for Western Mass, but as a project for the whole state, it changed the tenor of the conversation completely. So, for example, some of the biggest challenges you have in Eastern Mass are completely out of control housing prices and just soul crushing traffic. And, the MBTA is overloaded. I don't know how you can't move. There was a brief break during COVID, but it's back. The traffic is awful.
I can say absolutely, sitting here in my office, it is back.
Western Mass has the inverse challenge. We don't have terrible traffic, but our housing prices, for the most part, are much lower than Eastern Mass, but we don't have the red hot economy. We don't have the jobs. So rail is actually going to solve both issues. It's going to give Eastern Mass access to that higher quality of life, that lower cost of living. It gives Western Mass access to that red hot economy and that fast paced job market. And we started presenting that way. And all of a sudden, the Boston Chamber of Commerce endorsed it, and the Springfield Chamber of Commerce. The Boston City Council passed a resolution in support, and the Springfield City Council passed a resolution in support. The companies on both ends, like Mass Mutual, has a big Boston office and a headquarters in Springfield, came out in support. Housing advocates, environmental advocates, just thinking through the different elements. So you just always want to be in a game of addition in your advocacy. If you're making an argument that's pushing people away from you, that's the wrong kind of argument. You want to make an argument that expands the circle.
Mm.
And I would connect this, Jeremy, actually to the Israel work, because I think sometimes the conversation around Israel creates circles that we actually have to widen the circle. We have to bring more people in. You care about environmental policy? Well, Israel championed drip irrigation and water conservation and planted more trees per capita than perhaps any country on earth. You care about, again, refugee policy we talked about. You care about science and technology. You care about gender equality. Women were serving in the IDF. One of the first female heads of state, Golda Meir, decades and decades and decades before America has had it. We still don't have it. Right. So I think we just always want to be thinking about in our advocacy how we expand the circle and do a game of addition rather than subtraction.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and this is sort of like one of those moments of and I can't help noticing, even just the way you just talked about Israel, some of your colleagues, I'm not going to name names and we're not going to get into that, but like a few years ago did a major bill here in Massachusetts about water, improving water access and environmental issues that was very much informed by the leadership that they saw in the Israeli water industry. And the technology that had been developed there and what's possible. So I definitely agree with you. There's a lot more to see in terms of that relationship when one expands those circles. But what strikes me, and this is just maybe as an observation, maybe you want to respond to it, but I also have one last question I'm going to ask you before we go. But it strikes me that as you talk about this issue of the rail connection, in a very similar way to the way that you've talked about economic opportunity in student loans, or the way you've talked about nonprofit security, you're asking us to be part of a bigger idea of citizenship. You know, you didn't come to my experience seeing you work on nonprofit security, which was close to our heart here at JCRC. You didn't come to it like just do it for the Jewish community. You know, you talked about Black churches. It was about a larger idea for you. The way you're coming to this East-West thing, you talk about the Boston City Council. That something that gets lost in our politics right now is this larger sense of being citizens of Massachusetts.
Right.
And you've definitely approached each of these issues asking us to hold an idea of self that is bigger than my piece of the pie, mm-hmm. and seeing what's good for the Commonwealth. And I wonder, for another day, or maybe when we are on the next bus together someday, to have a long conversation about how we can do more to foster that kind of sort of sense of collective civic engagement in our politics. If you have, and then I'll go to the last question.
No, I mean, it's a really, this is the issue, right? Which is politics has become atomized and narrowed. And, you know, I'm just lucky that I had figures in my early and kind of formative years that I watched. You know, one of the people, you know, David Axelrod is an example. I mean, he's a Jewish guy from, originally from the Lower East Side of New York. He ran the campaign of Harold Washington, who was the first Black mayor of Chicago, ran Deval Patrick's media operation when he ran for governor. Of course, made history with President Obama. I saw how Barack Obama operated, which was to always be, he approached every engagement from how do I add people to my argument rather than take away. And unfortunately, social media now really acts against that, because you create a feedback mechanism that makes it seem like, because your stuff is getting retweeted a lot or you're getting a lot of likes, that you know, that you've got all these people behind you. But what you actually need to realize is look through it and you're realizing you got all the same people behind you. So what we've really got to do in our politics now is work to build in cross purpose with each other.
I would love to expand on that conversation for hours the next time we're together, but I'm going to leave you with one last question, because you've been, as always, Senator, incredibly generous with your time and your thoughts, but it has been a bit of a distraction and also a curiosity. Tell us about that bear behind you.
So this is from the Caring Force. So people probably know the Providers Council. Mm-hmm. So that's it's the association of all the different human service workers around the state. So I won one of their awards this year for some work. Actually, we're doing around student loan deferrals for human service workers, people working in group homes, people working with the disabled, people working with people suffering from substance abuse or mental illness. So anyway, that was the award. So it's fun. I actually, my daughter Nora, the 4-year-old, she sleeps with it. So then I pull it out of the. I have a routine in the morning. I take it out and I put it here, and then I put it back.
Got it.
When she's home.
There's nothing like getting an award for your work that also brings care and joy to your children. And I hope that there are many more things over the course of your career that will continue to do so, not only awards, but the leadership you brought. Listen, Eric, my friend, Senator Lesser, you've been incredibly generous, and I really just want to thank you for sharing your stories with us today. I hope that people who are with us got a chance to see a little bit of the guy and the leader that I have come to know and have great affection for, and really just endlessly grateful to you for all that you are doing, both for your constituents and for our community and the Commonwealth as a leader, both in the Jewish community and for the entirety of Massachusetts. So thank you for your time. For those who are interested in learning more about JCRC's legislative priorities, you can go to our website. We'll throw that link in the chat about our advocacy agenda. And I invite everybody to come back for our next speaker series, which will be on Monday, June 28th at 12 p.m. Our theme will be Journeys of Loss and Hope. And I don't remember if we actually were with them on our last trip with the senator, but it will include leaders from the Parents Circle Families Forum, Robbie Damelin and Layla El Sheikh, along with Chaplain Clementina Cherry of the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute here in Boston. They'll be talking about their own journeys of loss and hope and how they are working to build a better future every day, both in Boston and in Israel. We'll throw a link in the chat and in the follow-up email. So thank you again, Senator, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.